This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Lee Chang, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 476 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Scott Edelman. He's the author of the novel The Gift, and he's also published over 100 short stories, which have been collected in books such as What Will Come After and Things That Never Happened. He's also worked as an editor for Marvel Comics, Science Fiction Age, and the Sci-Fi Channel, and he's the host of the science fiction podcast Eating the Fantastic. And we'll be speaking with him today about his short story collection Tell Me Like You Done Before, which pays tribute to some of his favorite writers. And now here's our interview with Scott Edelman. All right, so we're here with Scott Edelman. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Okay, so I just read your collection, Tell Me Like You Done Before. So how'd this book come about?
It was actually an accidental collection. I had never expected to do it. There came a point in time where I had published so many stories. I think I'm up to 102 stories. My 102nd just came out. That I realized I had written many stories that were homages or takeoffs or sequels to the author's stories I loved, and there were enough of them. And I happened to be at ReaderCon one day talking to Steve Berman, who is the publisher of this press, Lethe Press, and I said to him, gee, someday I might attempt to pull this together and see if it makes sense as a collection. Tell Me Like You've Done Before, the title story, is based on Of Mice and Men, and I can tell you a little bit more about that story. And the minute I dropped this concept, Steve said, that's a wonderful idea for a collection. Pull it together and make the list, and let's see what actually exists. And I had enough stories, I feel, that have made for a good collection to honor all the people who inspired me. And the subtitle of that collection is And Other Stories Written on the Shoulders of Giants, because it's really part of this great continuum of fantasy and science fiction and horror.
So tell me about the cover, because the cover is really striking.
Well, the artist, whose last name I hope I am pronouncing correctly because we have not actually met, Matthew John Sophie, Soffee, is a wonderful caricaturist, and he did portraits of many of the people who were in this book who inspired me. Ray Bradbury, Thornton Wilder, Shakespeare, Rod Serling, H.G. Wells, Edgar Allan Poe, Ernest Hemingway, and Raymond Carver are the ones that made the cover, but there are many other people who inspired me as well. Shel Silverstein and so many other Joanna Russ. Joanna Russ is one of the people who inspired me. I mentioned more in the afterword than actually the stories represent. But James Tiptree Jr., Alice Sheldon, was one of the ones whose stories inspired me to write one of the stories in this book. And it's basically those caricatures were put together with a hand pulling away a curtain, and you can see the heads of all of the writers who inspired me over the years, or at least the ones contained within this book.
So did they tell you that, did you know that that's what the cover was going to look like? Did they just kind of spring it on you, or did you talk to them about it?
There was some back and forth, and we had many different suggestions. We were talking at one point about, if you remember, the kind of covers that the great Leo and Diane Dillon did, where it would be made up of various objects that made a larger face. And then we thought, maybe we could do that. And Steve found this wonderful artist, Matthew John Sophie, to whom I'm apologizing if it's a long E or a short E, who does these wonderful drawings. And I went to the guy's website, examined his artwork, fell in love with it, and I said, that sounds absolutely perfect to capture all these and make sure there are enough of them on the cover to know it's not any one single artist, one single writer represented in the book. You wouldn't want someone to think, oh, it's all Ray Bradbury inspired stories, or it's all Rod Serling Twilight Zone stories, but to know it's an amalgam of everything that helped make me who I am over the years. And this represents, I guess, 10% of the fiction, maybe 10 to 15% of the stories that I've written, but there's enough of them that it made sense to do a collection such as this one.
Mm-hmm. So do you remember how you got started doing these homages? Because one of the story, speaking of Twilight Zone, the story Fifth Dimension looks like goes back to 1983. So you've been at this a while.
That might be my first story written that is a deliberate homage. So of course, if you go back far enough, I began my writing career in comic books, and I guess at one point everything I wrote was an homage to Stan Lee, because I was trying to be the guy who, when I was a kid, writing I love. But when it came to working on the text fiction, this idea just came to me for the story that ended up being published in the Twilight Zone. And the odd thing about it is that even though I learned that I worked only a couple of blocks from the office where the Twilight Zone editor worked, I refused to see him. All the stories I sent back and forth and got rejected. You think some other writer might have said to the editor, hey, why don't we have lunch and you can tell me what's really wrong with my stories? But instead, in my head, I decided I'm not going to see this guy. This is a story called Fifth Dimension, and it posits that I wrote Twilight Zone magazine, which at the time was publishing an episode guide to the Twilight Zone, and I was writing saying, gee, you left out this episode and that episode and this wonderful episode, and the editor says, gee, those are not really episodes. I think you're making things up. And it was just a back and forth. And it ends up that my TV is picking up stories from the Fifth Dimension, that Rod Serling is still off somewhere making all sorts of other wonderful episodes. And the great thing about this story is that the editor, Ted Klein, had to run it by Carol Serling, Rod Serling's widow, because, well, once you're including something like that in a magazine that they're doing with the permission of the Serling estate, you want to make sure his widow is pleased with it and honored by it. And the fact that Carol Serling said, oh no, I love this story, it treats Rod Serling in such a wonderful way, go ahead and use it, made me very happy.
I mean, you said that you explained in the book that you never wanted to meet the editors because you were afraid that you wanted your work to stand on its own and not have them be charmed by your personality.
Well, whether I would have charmed them or not, I don't know. But I was very anal about it, and I had many rules for myself that I followed, because I did want an editor to only buy it based on the words on the page. I don't want them to say, oh, Scott made a funny joke at that party I saw them at. And I would really resist meeting editors. I was being very foolish about one's career, because in the final analysis, it doesn't really matter whether you become friends with an editor or not friends with an editor. I've been rejected by some of my closest friends, and I've had stories purchased by people I know who did not necessarily like me as a human being, but those editors had ethics and standards, and all they cared about is what it's going to convey to a reader. So I basically told people, look, don't do what I did. If you feel that you can meet someone at a party and not have them hate you, don't drink too much and then throw up on their shoes, so they go and say, boy, I don't ever want to see anything by that guy. There's no harm in that. But I had all sorts of rules that I followed. I remember once at a World Fantasy Con, someone said, hey, you want to meet the publisher, you want to meet Jim Baen? And I said, nope, I might submit something to them someday. And so that a lot of my early conventions were like that.
It was funny. I understand where you're coming from, because I had exactly the same thing when I was a young teenager, probably 14 or something. My mom said, oh, like one of her friends was friends with this editor. Did I want to meet him? And I was like, no, for exactly the reason you say. And then years later, I was like, what was the name of that editor? And she's like, oh, it was Gordon Van Gelder. And I was like,
And the thing is, Gordon would not have purchased a substandard story. So the thing that you feared, that I feared, would not have occurred, that, oh, they're going to buy a bad story just because they know me or they like me. And that is not what happens. So it's not really what. So all these people who think there's a secret cabal and friends are only buying stories from their friends and things like that, that isn't actually what's going on. And if I'd known that 30 years ago, I might have had more fun at some parties that I chose not to go to back in the early days.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, looking back on it, there was no danger of Gordon buying a story from me when I was a teenager. That was definitely not something I needed to be concerned about.
Nor my early stories, many of which have since been destroyed. I destroyed my first 25 short stories so they would not damage the world in the event of my death. Not that anyone is hungering to publish every story I write while I'm alive, but there came a point when I said, oh, these early stories have to go. I saved my very first short story out of nostalgia because I said, okay, well, the one I wrote when I was 16, I'm just hanging on to that one to look back on and laugh. But story number 2 through 26, they're all gone. Somewhere I have a bullet point list of what the plot was, one sentence for each one, but I don't want anyone to read those.
Well, so talk about the title, Tell Me Like You Done Before. What does that mean?
It seemed like a perfect title to the book. It is the title of one of the stories in the book, one of the fastest stories I've ever written. I am a slow writer. They grow very slow like coral. Tell Me Like You Done Before, for people who are familiar with Of Mice and Men, the John Steinbeck classic with the lumbering Lenny and his friend George, and they go around working on farms and baling hay and everything, was a story I wrote for a zombie anthology in which I posited that Lenny, I hate to give a spoiler for Of Mice and Men. If anyone has not read Of Mice and Men, does not want to know how Of Mice and Men ends, fast forward a minute or two, but at the end of Mice and Men, George must kill his friend Lenny because he knows what horrible things will happen to Lenny because of some of the things Lenny, in his ignorance and lumberingness, has done. And I have posited that actually, when George shoots Lenny through the head, he sort of misses, and then Lenny comes back as a zombie and is coming after George throughout the story. Now, Tell Me Like You've Done Before is a line that Lenny in their lives would always say to George, tell me about the rabbits again. Oh, we're going to buy a farm. We're not just going to be farmhands. We're going to have this wonderful thing. Tell me like you've done before. Tell me that story about the rabbits, how we're going to be our own men and everything and live off the fat of the land. And it occurred to me as I was looking at the stories in this book that Tell Me Like You've Done Before, for an anthology that has retellings of stories that you might have heard before, is absolutely perfect. And the publisher agreed, and that's how it ended up being that story. I did feel I wanted to include that subhead about and other stories written on the shoulders of giants so people would understand the whole concept of the book.
Do you remember exactly like that idea of the zombie Of Mice and Men? Do you remember how that came to you? Like, how far into your zombie phase were you at this point?
Oh, I was quite a ways into my zombie phase by that point. I mean, I've been writing zombie stories for decades. I mean, one of the other stories in the book, which is Shakespearean zombie story, so Romeo and Juliet meets Night of the Living Dead, called The Plague on Both Your Houses, was written, I think at least a decade, if not longer before. And this one just all of a sudden came to me as, and of course, this is this is one of these stories. And when I say I write stories slowly, to me, 400 or 500 words a day is a magnificent day. And I do a lot of rewriting, a lot of polishing. And this entire story came out of me in a weekend. And it reminded me of that story where a guy's car stops on the road. The repairman comes and fixes the thing in about a minute and charges him $50. It's $50 for a minute, and the mechanic says, "No, not for a minute. The $50 is for the 30 years I learned how to do this stuff. The minute is free." And that's the way I felt about this story. I played Lenny in Of Mice and Men. It was a magnificent experience to do that. It is something that I saw Of Mice and Men, a TV version or movie version as a kid, and it's always been extremely powerful story to me. And the idea just came and burbled out of me. I knew every single thing that was going to happen, which is very rare because I am a pantser, not a plotter. So I normally start not knowing where I'm heading, but this one was boom. And I guess I had to write it that quickly because once I know the ending, I can get bored. So there are stories I know the ending to that I don't write, but this one came out of me in an explosion over the course of a weekend, and people seem to like it, and it ended up being the title of the book.
Yeah, and also I really want to recommend the story you just mentioned, "A Plague on Both Your Houses," and it's written in iambic pentameter and everything. I actually last night I read it out loud to my girlfriend, and she really liked it too. So definitely
Well,
recommend that one.
to carry back to something else you said about Gordon Van Gelder, the mention of Gordon Van Gelder, this story was read aloud at a World Horror Convention. Actually, I'm sorry, it was not a World Horror Convention. It was probably a Bram Stoker Awards weekend, because at that time the Horror Writers Association held their own events, and it was nominated for a Stoker Award. And Stoker Award nominees normally do a reading, and since this has all these characters in it, I decided I can't do this. I can't do a reading, and I dragged friends of mine on stage to read the various parts so we could pull it off. So Mike Morano, Ed Bryant was in there, Gordon Van Gelder, Nina Kariki Hoffman, all these people helped perform the play, and I wish we'd recorded it, and we did not. But Gordon ended up doing a marvelous job, particularly since there's a line in there about using the sword, and if I had a pen, I would edit you, or something like that. I can't remember the line off the top of my head, but it's just so perfect that that line ended up coming out of his mouth at the time. He was not yet the publisher of FNSF, he was the editor. But that's a story that came about because when I go to conventions, I am filled with energy. I was driving home from World Horror Convention in Nashville, and all of a sudden the opening lines came to me, and I just thought, yep, Night of the Living Dead and Romeo and Juliet, where a kid of a zombie and the kid of a human end up falling in love, and all the various things that happen, and gravediggers and nurses and switcheroos and sword fights, and it was a lot of fun to write. And oddly, it was one of, even though it was my first Stoker nomination, it was one of my hardest stories to sell. I shouldn't say oddly, because it's a play, a 5-act play with a prologue and an afterlog, and it's iambic pentameter. So yeah, I guess it's not that odd that it would be difficult to sell. But I was very proud that it got me my first of 8 Bram Stoker Award nominations.
Well, you say one editor rejected it because he's like, I'm just not that into Shakespeare.
That was hilarious, because I thought, I have found the perfect home. Someone was doing a zombie anthology, and I thought, oh, this is absolutely perfect. And I sent it in, and the response was, oh, I don't like Shakespeare. So it had nothing to do with the story or whether I pulled it off well or whether there was poetry in the language. It was just, we don't like Shakespeare. So the story itself was secondary to this person's distaste for Shakespeare. I ended up, in fact, giving up attempting to have it published professionally, and I put it together as a Halloween card one year, and I sent it to all of my friends. And based on that, it ended up being published in the Stephen Jones Best New Horror of the Year, and based on that publication, it ended up getting nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. So stories have strange paths to publication and recognition. So I always tell people, do not worry if it takes a while for things to, find the right audience. And Steve Jones ended up being the right audience, and then my fellow horror writers ended up liking it. So I was very proud of that.
Is that intimidating, sort of inviting comparisons between yourself as a writer and Shakespeare or Steinbeck or, all these sort of great authors?
I don't think it has ever been a fear. It certainly takes a lot of chutzpah, but doesn't writing itself take a lot of chutzpah? To think that anybody gives a damn about anything that you have to say and put forward into the world is a lot of ego to that. So I don't think that I ever worried that someone was going to read, my sequel to The Giving Tree, my imagination of that, and say, oh my goodness, this is not written as well as Shel Silverstein, or certainly, when I did the sequel, the dual sequel to the James Tiptree stories, to multiple James Tiptree stories. The Women Men Don't See is just a magnificent story, and you think no one could possibly top that. And yet I imagine it does take a lot of chutzpah, again, to that and the Screwfly Solution, 2 stories I read and reread often. Luckily, no one has ever come back to me and said, "Who do you think you are?" in any of these. And I'm not quite sure what I would say other than, well, these stories are to say thank you. They were not attempting to equal or top these people I admire so much. It's sort of, something I did in my head to say thank you to these wonderful people. Same thing for Ray Bradbury, who I was lucky enough, to meet several times. Most recently, it's not that, it's a little bit ago, but it was the San Diego Comic-Con. So I'm just glad to be able to say thank you to the people who came before and helped mold me.
Do you just, when you're channeling the voice of another author, do you just sort of do that intuitively, or do you have any process where you, like, I don't know, copy out a page of their writing or read it out loud or anything like that?
Well, I find that the writing of other people is very infectious, and you sometimes hear other writers say that, "Oh, I can't read other people while I'm working on a story. I have to do no reading while the story is going on." And I'm not quite like that. That is why I had to leave comics when I was writing comics. I worked for Marvel, and I realized that my fiction was starting to sound like Stan Lee. All the alliteration was appearing in my regular fiction. So I learned a long time ago that I am susceptible to other people's styles and cadences. So, for instance, with the title story, I did reread all of Mice and Men before sitting down to write the story. It's a short book. I did reread The Giving Tree. Shakespeare is fairly easy. Didn't have to reread anything of that. I think from schooling and just from being alive, Shakespeare is so in all of our bones that we don't necessarily have to do that. And some of the things in terms of rereading, I've loved them always. When I think of, Thornton Wilder and, being in love with Thornton Wilder and, Of Mice and Men is the same thing, but being in love with Our Town, I've seen Our Town so many times. Both Of Mice and Men and Our Town leave me in tears at the end. So I did not have to even go back and reread Our Town, except when it came time for a title, because I wanted the title of that story to be a quote from the story, and I had to refresh myself which of many sentences worked best, and that one is called "Live People Don't Understand," which is from one of my favorite scenes in Our Town. And so that's about as much as I have done, and because writing is just so infectious. So I do have the story I'm working on now, which is not inspired by anyone. I am not reading any fiction while I am working on this short story. I'm only reading non-fiction, a book of essays by Chip Delaney.
I want to ask you about this story, What We Still Talk About, which I was just blown away by. I think it's a spectacular story.
Thank
and it's, it's written in the mode of Raymond Carver, but it's this sort of far future post-human science fiction story. So in terms of subject matter, it's very different from what people might expect.
Yes, and that's an interesting thing, or an odd thing about the collection, because so many collections people put out, you try to have a singular concept. Oh, all of my horror stories go in this book, all the zombie stories go in this book, all the science fiction stories go in this book. But the fact that Tell Me Like You've Done Before, the central conceit is the homage, it means I have gathered science fiction and horror and fantasy and bittersweet fantasy or bittersweet horror. So there's a mix of flavors here beyond what any of my other collections are. But, this one basically takes my favorite Raymond Carver story, what we talk about when we talk about love, and imagines it in a post-human future when we can basically do anything, and one person decides, for reasons which become obvious in the story, gee, why don't we go back to Earth again and see where everything began? And you have a character who is just sort of exists in the mist and is everywhere and is all around us, and characters who can change their size, characters who exist in multiple versions of themselves with a shared consciousness. And it's about what happens to them when they go back to Earth, and talking about love in the future, what we talk about when we talk about love. And this one is talking about what we still talk about. And I do love Raymond Carver, and I attempted to, as in Raymond Carver's story, which is about two couples and dealing with the relationship and their love or lack of love or boredom with love, or I sort of posited that way into the future as we return to the Earth that used to be, which I, without giving too many spoilers, it's there and it's not there, and they have so much superhuman powers that they can basically do whatever they want, but in the end they're still human. So I'm pleased that you were pleased with it.
Yeah, and it's just such an interesting dovetailing of these ideas of the characters feeling this pointlessness and ennui in this Raymond Carver story with the far future post-humans who feel everything is pointless because they can do anything, and so nothing really, there are no stakes really for anything. And it was just interesting how those two sort of themes dovetail.
Yeah, science fiction has come up with that a lot. There are so many stories we've seen where we think being immortal will be wonderful, and then we realize, oh, life is not wonderful unless we're not immortal, and things have more meaning because we could lose them at any moment. That's not really necessarily what this story is about, but it comes down to all the things we think might be solutions aren't necessarily solutions, because in the end you are still left with yourself, no matter how strong or powerful or magical you become.
I thought I didn't know this in the note. You say that Raymond Carver actually started out writing some science fiction stories and kind of gave them up at some point.
None of which exist. Raymond Carver was an alcoholic, had a very sad life until his second wife he got together with, and somehow he ended up becoming sober with that relationship. But there are an awful lot of his early life, he was basically tossed drunk out of apartments and all his possessions on the front lawn. And he did start out writing a lot of science fiction stories. And when I saw that quote, I edited Science Fiction Age magazine, and I suggested to Barry Malzberg that, hey, did you realize this? Why don't you write a science fiction story as if it had been written by Raymond Carver, which he did, and it was published in Science Fiction Age a long time ago. But I would kill to actually read one of the stories that Raymond Carver wrote that was intended to be a science fiction story. And we don't know why he no longer cared about science fiction. His first wife said, eventually he was no longer interested in writing about little green monsters, but was it that he couldn't sell them and he said, oh, this is stupid? Or was it that he decided, he got into John Gardner's writing class, that he just decided it was beneath him? We don't really know what his relationship was, but it would be wonderful to go back and find some of those. And it's not necessarily that I wrote saying specifically that I'm going to write a science fiction story that he would have written. It just seemed like a perfect match. This particular story came about because Peter Crowther was doing an anthology, Forbidden Planets, and it seemed to fit in perfectly. So it's inspired by, but it's not, as before, it's not attempting to be him. So hopefully no one will say, well, it's not as good as what we talk about when we talk about love. Because, yes, that's true for 99.9% of the other stories written on this planet.
So was that Barry Malzberg story that you had him write, was that sort of, did it come out kind of how you had imagined, or was it a lot different than what you expected?
I don't think there's anyone else on the planet better suited to pretend to be writing a Raymond Carver science fiction story than Barry Malzberg. I think he did exactly the job that I wanted to be. I knew Barry loved Raymond Carver as much as I do, if not more. We both looked at the unedited manuscripts because Raymond Carver had been heavily edited by Gordon Lish, and there's a lot of controversial stuff over whether Gordon Lish did too much editing in places. But I knew that Barry would do a wonderful job on it. Unfortunately, I can't remember the title of Barry's story at the moment, but I imagine if you just sort of Google Barry Malzberg Science Fiction Age Raymond Carver, it will turn up.
Well, yeah, because when you mentioned Science Fiction Age, I did want to ask you about that because, I first met you at the Clarion Workshop in 1999. I was a student and you were one of the guests.
22 years ago, my goodness.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, at that time you were editing Science Fiction Age, and I was realizing that I don't really know that whole story of how did you become the editor of Science Fiction Age?
It was an accident. So much in my life happens due to serendipity rather than through deliberate conscious action. My wife had been looking for a job, looked in the Washington Post, and there was an ad there under editor for looking for part-time editor to edit science fiction magazine. And I said, wow, I can do that. I had edited other magazines in the past. My career started as an editor at Marvel Comics. And I wrote them probably the most obnoxious letter anyone ever wrote to attempt to get a job, because I felt that I had a certain, I don't know, status in the field as doing things of quality. And there are many, not very good science fiction magazines or science fiction magazines that mistreat the field, mistreat the writers and artists that they use. And I basically said the question isn't whether you would hire me. The question is whether I would work for you for this, to edit this magazine. And that must have impressed them enough. I explained some of the other things I had done. That I basically know everyone who they might want to have published and so on. They called me in for an interview, and it was one of the weirdest meetings that I ever had. It's a couple of guys who had previously published Civil War and military history magazines, and their whole concept for publishing a magazine is they wanted to have 20,000 subscribers before they produced a single issue of the magazine. I'd never heard of such a thing. I'm not into the direct mail, and I was not into the direct mail thing. And they basically, when they interviewed with me, said, okay, we're going to hire you to put together a mailing, and if we get a certain percentage return on this mailing, we will go ahead and do the magazine. I said, that's really very bizarre. But basically, to back up, one of the reasons I got the job is when they hired me, that mailing had to go out 3 months from when we were having the conversation, because evidently, and I don't remember the specific dates, but something like December 27th or December 23rd is the best time to send out a direct mailing to anyone to get a good response. And the second best date is a date in May. I don't know why. Maybe one is, everyone has Christmas gift money and they can subscribe to things, or they're in a good mood. And I realized, how in the world are they going to do this in 3 months? And overnight, I put together a proposal, said, look, if you really want to do this, at that point, we just had an interview. I said, if you really want to do this, you have to start doing it now. There is no way you can hit your mailing date. I'm giving you this much for free. This is what I think you have to do in order to pull this off. And I guess based on that, they were impressed, and they hired me, and they did the mass mailing. And the science of mass mailings was so precise that after only mailing 20,000 of them and getting, I forget what they get. They did get like a 3% response, which is better than most people. They then mailed on that May date 400,000 of them, and they told me exactly when they would have, was it 20,000 or 25,000 subscriptions? And they were right within a day. So there is a science based on examining the stats of the small mailing. They knew exactly when they get that. And then we had Science Fiction Age for 8.5 years. And I'm so pleased with what we're able to do. 2 writers I published, 1 Nebula Awards, Martha Sukup the first year, and Mary Tizillo at the end. And it was just a wonderful, wild ride, and a bizarre one, because who thinks of, oh, I'm not publishing a magazine, I'm publishing a mass mailing, and maybe we'll do a magazine. So I had to buy stories where the writer knew, here's a kill fee, I'm paying you this much money to use your name that your story is coming, and if we publish a story, you'll get the other half. And it ended up working for a nice long time, and the first issue had 175,000 copies out there. So for the first year or two, it was a top-selling magazine, short only of something like Omni that was selling millions. But I could talk to you for far longer than you would want to hear. When the magazine was finally canceled, I actually did a 1-hour talk on exactly how this came to be, why it succeeded, and then why it eventually ended up dying, which was supposedly recorded at a convention, but I've never been able to track down the recording when I was a guest of honor at Ad Astra, because it would be wonderful to have the contemporaneous explanation of this bizarre story of how these guys do this. And when I met them, they had 10 Civil War magazines with circulations over 100,000 on each one, not Civil War, military history, variety of military history magazines. So they know what they're doing and they know how to find niches. And I was glad to have been a part of it for that period of time.
Yeah, I would love to hear that recording if that ever turns up, because Science Fiction Age, it did have production values vastly in excess of most other science fiction magazines. It was all full color, glossy pages, all these ads and beautiful artwork and all this stuff. And I always wondered how. I mean, I know Omni had sort of money from, this is my understanding, Bob Guccione and Penthouse Magazine behind it. So I guess there was some large resources behind this publisher for Science Fiction Age as well.
Well, it wasn't just large resources, and just to give you just a quick explanation, most science fiction magazines fail, I believe, because one person attempts to do everything, meaning the editor says, I can sell ads, I can deal with distributors, I can do all these things, and one person normally does not have all of those talents, and so therefore I've seen a lot of them attempt to do that and fail. But in this case, one of the reasons it succeeded is I dealt with the editorial. A guy named Carl Nam at the beginning, he dealt with all the art and design, and Mark Hintz dealt with all the business side of it. And we each kept our own piece of turf, and we were each good at our own piece of turf. And we were attempting our best not to intrude on what the other person was doing. We give advice, of course, but it worked because you did not have one person trying to run everything. And it also goes back to a joke you probably heard, which is about publishing is, how do you make $1 million in publishing? It's, well, start with 2 million.
Yeah.
So I have seen certain science fiction magazines that are small attempt to get big. There's a magazine, Science Fiction Review, that I love, that I think that we're selling 8,000 to 10,000, and they said now we want to try and sell 50,000, and they rushed more copies out there. And it's very difficult to go from small to big. It's easier to either start big and get small, or to be unknown and wow people, and they allow you to filter out through the bookshops and the newsstands, and it'll allow it to be quite big for quite a while. But there's a whole science to this. But it was a beautiful magazine. They were calling it, the tagline was sort of, for us, thinking, okay, the Rolling Stone of science fiction, that we're trying to be at that level.
I mean, it's been like, it's been a tough time for print magazines the past few decades. Do you feel like the demise of Science Fiction Age was kind of just part of that, or do you feel like was there sort of a parallel timeline in which Science Fiction Age is still going?
Well, it was time for one magazine to go, I think, and it ended up, unfortunately, being Science Fiction Age. I know at time we were thinking that, okay, if we can outlast Asimov's, let's say, and then we would get their readers, or they would get our readers, or something like that. It didn't seem, as newsstands were shrinking, there were fewer newsstands to hold the magazines. It was more difficult to find the casual reader. And the other old rule is, what happens is, let's say a bookstore puts out 10 copies of a magazine and only sells 9. Then next time they should only give us 9. Well, then they'll sell 8. And it'll shrink and shrink and shrink, when you always have to leave something there. If you don't have an issue left on the newsstand, you haven't printed enough copies to find that new reader. So, and with that, it's the death of advertising also. Once car ads and cigarette ads, those don't come in unless you get to 500,000 copies, which no science fiction magazine other than Omni has ever gotten to. And when Analog tried that, in the 60s, when they went from digest size to large size, thinking they would get car and cigarette ads, and that really didn't happen. They eventually shrunk back down. But this is probably a lot more inside baseball. But it really is amazing, and we hope that science fiction magazines will continue. Luckily, we have all the online magazines that have leapt into the fray, Lightspeed and Clark's World, and so many of the other wonderful magazines, Uncanny and Strange Horizons and Faya. But I mean, there's such a healthy online presence now for science fiction, and so many wonderful things which are only appearing online. And today, if I were to start a magazine over, I would definitely go for the online model rather than attempting to do a paper one. Maybe I'd put together a best of paper Kickstarter anthology sometime at the end, but I'm not doing that now. I'm having more fun writing the stories because it's very difficult to do both. Often many editors, we've lost many editors. I mean, think of the great Gardner Dozois when he took over editing Asimov. He was always a slow writer to begin with, but it's tough to read as I did. I was reading about 800 short stories a month and still publish fiction as well. So one can only do so much in one's life.
Well, I did want to ask you, one of your stories was published in the Journal of Pulse Pounding Narratives. And in your author's note, you say that it only lasted for 2 issues, and the message from the editors was, quote, "It is our fondest wish that if there are young people out there who dream of running a zine, they will see the path of misery and despair that we have so foolishly trodden and turn another way."
And it is true, and that was a wonderful magazine. And I love that magazine, and I love the fact that I got to publish the extremely bizarre story there, which is called This Is Where the Title Goes, which is published in this little zine. And yet I have had so many people tell me that they were teaching this story to students. Most recently, Nalo Hopkinson, who was teaching a Clarion class this semester, said, "Do you mind if I teach this one to the students this year?" But both John Kessel and John Crowley in the university level have taught this particular story, which I feel owes its birth to people like Italo Calvino and Manuel Puig. We can sort of think of Italo Calvino as a fantasy writer, though I know some would say, oh, no, he's just a literary writer. And Manuel Puig. And this story of mine is the skeleton of a story as opposed to the crunchy candy outside coating of a story. I've tried to tell a story that was the skeleton of all stories. And ideally, it would have been published anonymously, because instead of a title, what it says at the beginning is, "This is where the title goes," and it should have been published as byline, rather than having an actual person. But it's basically describing the purpose to the story of each sentence in the story, and hopefully managing to be entertaining in its own right. And I was stunned the first time someone said, "Do you mind if I teach this in a class?" I'll just read you the first sentence or two just to give people an idea, because they might be saying, "What the heck is he talking about?" But the way it begins is, "This opening sentence is supposed to make you stop breathing. This next sentence is supposed to allow you to start again, even as you forget you're holding a book or magazine. This third sentence you read is supposed to make you forget the act of reading, as if the words were your life instead of your dream." And hopefully people don't think that's too precious, but it continues on and actually tells a story while telling the underpinnings of all fiction at the same time. And I'm so glad that odd little zine that warned people not to publish odd little zines was willing to publish it, and that people seem to get a kick out of it.
That doesn't surprise me at all that people have taught that in writing classes and things, because that's exactly what I was thinking when I was reading it. Is, it seems like a good thing to assign in a setting like that.
And it makes me, I guess I'm extremely proud of that. I don't know whether that's the only time anyone has at least come to me and told me they wanted to teach that story. And particularly 3 people who I so admire, John Kessel, John Crowley, and Al Hopkinson, have all said, "Do you mind if I teach this?" both in a Clarion class and at the university level. So I am thrilled by it, and I have read that out loud. It's one of the ones that I get choked up when I read. I don't know if that has happened to you, if you've done a reading ever where you realize as it's reaching its conclusion, you become so gravid with emotion that you choke up a little bit. And this is one of those that does that to me, and as does the one that's inspired by Shel Silverstein. And sometimes you don't know until you read it aloud. You can write a story and realize it's powerful and be moved by it, but there's something about the act of speech that requires a different level of control. And if you are overwhelmed by emotion, your voice just chokes down and you can't get the words out. And there have occasionally been stories that I've read at conventions where I have had to pause and apologize to the audience before going on, that I was so moved. They say comedians aren't supposed to laugh at their own jokes. I guess writers should not. I mean, if you're an actor, you're not supposed to start crying at the sad part unless you're meant to be crying. It's the audience is supposed to feel that. But occasionally a story has done that to me while reading it aloud.
Well, that definitely happens to me, but I get choked up pretty easily. Actually, when I was describing to my girlfriend, I was describing your Of Mice and Men story. And so I was like, oh, well, first I have to describe the plot of Mice and Men. And just giving the plot synopsis, I was getting choked up when I came to the end of just, what happened, telling her what happens in Of Mice and Men. So, yeah.
Oh, well, that one, and definitely the Our Town story, which turns out to be a lot of people don't understand, which is another zombie story. Hopefully that people don't think there are too many zombies. And it's not all zombies, folks. But there's a scene in Our Town where a deceased person is given the chance to go back and for one day and see what life is like, because the dead sort of die, but they have to sort of wither away a bit. They still are conscious, and then eventually they become one with the universe. And the stage manager, who is a character in this play, said, don't just pick an average day. Don't go back to anything fancy. Don't go back and look at your birthday or the day you got married. Just a normal day. And she comes back. I'm going to get choked up just talking about it, but and she basically looks at this average normal day and sees how beautiful and magnificent it is, and said, don't they see how wonderful life is? And she's told, well, a lot of people don't understand. They don't see the beauty in just the ordinary. And when I read this story and get to the end, which I will not give away, no spoilers here, but that's one that I get very choked up, because the play itself chokes me up. That whole last scene that's set in a cemetery as the dead are speaking to each other as they prepare to sort of calcify and become one with the universe and with the eternal. So yeah, that's another one. When I read that one aloud, I am moved by, and I have to prepare myself. There is someone I have to say, even as I'm reading it, okay, that part is coming now. Okay, slow down, take a breath. Let the emotion pass over. I imagine it's the same thing that happens when you're about to have a tough conversation with a spouse or a parent, and okay, I don't want to cry during this, because if I cry, I won't get my message across. But sometimes I still do.
Yeah. Well, getting back to the idea of teaching for a second, I did want to ask you about your story, The Trembling Living Wire, and just how that came about.
That was one of those stories that come about because I heard that there was an anthology opening. Sometimes I manage to rise to the occasion of writing a story. It's not a story to order. It's basically a prompt. You hear out there, an editor is doing an anthology about cats. I never did one of those. I don't know why I went to cats. I think that's the cliche, the cat anthology. But I had heard that Ellen Datlow was doing an Edgar Allan Poe anthology, and when it comes to Edgar Allan Poe, there are many obvious Edgar Allan Poe stories that would be taken by people if you're going to write a sequel. The Trembling Living Wire is a line in Edgar Allan Poe's poem Israfel, and it got me thinking about the music of the spheres and angels and sound, and I don't necessarily think it's the story about writing or teaching, but this is one that came about because Ellen Datlow, who I respect as an editor, was doing this anthology. She ended up passing on that story just to let people know, just keep writing those stories. Doesn't matter who ends up rejecting them. And I ended up selling it to a Stephen Jones anthology that was not written specifically for, but he was doing an anthology about serial killers of the Bob Bloch psycho sort. And I ended up selling it to him. But it is basically about, I don't know whether to describe the poem or whether to describe the story, but the character of Israfel, despised an unimpassioned song is a quote. And I don't know whether people reading it, how long it would take them to pick up on the reference to the Poe story. And that's sort of a side tangent I imagine I should put in. I do not believe knowledge of the original stories that I am inspired by, or the authors who inspired me, is necessary to enjoy the stories themselves. I feel that's very important. You can't tell people, well, yes, you have to go get a doctoral degree in this other author before you like this story. It has to stand on its own. If you know it, yes, there are Easter eggs and there are resonances that will come out that won't occur to the uninitiated, but I feel it truly doesn't matter. So for this particular story, I was meditating on the poem and meditating on what the character in the poem might have gone on beyond the poem to experience, and then I therefore imagine that character, living in to our world and our present, and becoming a music teacher in the school, and what happens there, and how this person judges the voices of the students, and what the character does in order to make those voices achieve the passion or emotion that he must feed upon in order to find his own joy. So that's sort of a veiled way of describing what the story is about.
Well, I do want to describe the premise, because I mean, you see this in the first page or two, right? Is that this person causes tragedies for his students surreptitiously in order to kind of like be what do you call it, a character building, so that they it deepens their artistic talents. And I just think that's an interesting
yes, as far
idea.
as this person is concerned. Now, of course, as authors, you and I, both authors, know that there is the myth of the tortured, tragic writer artist, and many non-writers, non-artists want to believe that we all must be troubled souls, and that's why we can write these things, that writing comes out of pain and despair and the way of the world crushing down on us. And it might be that certain individual stories might come about because of that, when you are filled with pain or anger or something like that. But it is false that it is a necessary thing in the real world for a writer to have a miserable life or experience great tragedy in order to create great art. But yes, in this particular situation, the character hears this flavor in the voices of the children that the character teaches, that they do their best to help bring about by causing certain things to happen to them. And what happens later, you can find out by reading the story.
But so the story wasn't inspired in any way by your experiences teaching at Clarion or anything like that?
Oh, no, there was nothing. No, don't worry. I was not sneaking around behind the class, letting air out of people's tires, or killing their pets, or doing anything like that. No, I'm trying to think. Have I ever written anything directly a result of that? No. And so often people, like, I know my brother once said, oh, there's a particular story that there's a grandparent in this short story, therefore this is obviously inspired by one of our grandparents. Like, no. The same way actors act, and they may use Stanislavskian methods to call upon an emotion, there's not a one-to-one ratio when you're writing about a teacher that means it came out of your experiences being a teacher, nor out of your experiences being an axe murderer or a serial killer. That some of these things must rely on our imagination. I mean, teaching Clarion was a wonderful experience, but no, I don't think I've ever written anything that I could say is directly based upon being a teacher, other than the fact all of the writing that I do is part of being this community of science fiction folks. My first convention I went to when I was 15 years old, going to a comic book convention. So I've lived in this field. So you could sort of say everything is of the same piece. The life that I live and the stories that I write and the people who I see when I go to conventions or deal with online, it's all this big circular community that I love. So that may be the only way that it is somehow everything is connected to teaching. Maybe only the way all writing is. You're writing because you want to say something to somebody. That's not necessarily teaching in the formal way that we think of teaching, but it is attempting to communicate something that you feel about life.
Yeah. All right. So we're running a little short on time. And I did just want to mention, I mean, you mentioned that this book that we're talking about, Tell Me Like You've Done Before, has stories that are horror and science fiction and everything all mixed together. But for people who want their horror separate from their science fiction and stuff, I'll just mention that you have a collection called What We Still Talk About, which I think is all science fiction, right?
Yes, and that includes a story that you gave me such plaudits about. I'm so pleased you like it. That's all the science fiction. That's where you go if you want to find the robots and artificial intelligences and deep space and far futures.
Yeah, and I did. It did definitely make me curious to read more of your, far future science fiction. So I will probably track down that collection. And then you have one that's all the zombie stories called What Will Come After. And then you have a more recent one called Things That Never Happened, which I think is more sort of fantasy horror.
That is dark fantasy. Yes, Things That Never Happened is all, Twilight Zone-y, eerie stories. It's staying away from the zombie stories. It's for people who are familiar with horror, if they like Dennis Etchison, Charlie Grant, those people we think of as the quiet horror, Ramsey Campbell, the folks who, it's not that I'm sickened because someone's head is exploding. It's that the hair on the back of my neck is rising up and I'm feeling real creepy and eerie reading this story. It's that the fiction of discomfort as opposed to the fiction of gore. That's what you get in that one.
Yeah. So there's just all these different flavors of Scott Edelman collections, depending on your taste.
And Tell Me Like You've Done Before is really the tutti frutti. It's the everything bagel of Scott Edelman. That you get some horror, some science fiction, some of all the different flavors because of its theme.
Yeah. And then I also just want to mention that you do your own podcast called Eating the Fantastic. So you want to just tell people about that?
Well, I was once called the Anthony Bourdain of science fiction because when I go to a science fiction convention, I research the town the convention is in deeply because I do not want to waste any time on a hotel meal, and I would abscond with other guests and go to all these great restaurants around the town. And when it came time to be on a podcast, I was a guest on a podcast, and I suddenly realized, wait, you mean the workers can own the means of production? I can do a podcast and just put it out there and Apple will distribute it to everyone. And I thought, well, what should my niche be? Because I didn't just want to be another podcast. So I said, I will go out for meals with people. I will record those meals. You are coming along with me and eavesdropping on this conversation I have with various folks. And I've been doing that for 5 years now, more than 5 years. The 149th episode just went live last week with John Wiswell, this year's Best Short Story winner of a Nebula Award. And it has been a lot of fun capturing the voices of people, hopefully in a more casual way. My feeling was often in a studio, people are where there are microphones, and when there's food in front of them at the table, maybe they forget, oh yeah, that's right, we're being interviewed here, right? This is being recorded, and the food that makes people relax and forget, and that's what I wanted to do, this casual, informal discovery of who the writers I admire are. They're not just writers, agents, editors, all sorts of folks.
Yeah, and so I guess the pandemic kind of made it tough for a while to do that format, right?
I was going to go on hold, and only my Patreon people convinced me not to do it. They like the conversation so much that they said, well, wait a second, you can both get the same takeout. Why don't you both get Chinese food and do it online? And why don't you both bake? So it allowed me to, there's a writer in Germany named Steve Toast. We both had Wiener Schnitzel while we had a conversation. Farah Mendelssohn, we baked scones, and then we each ate our own scones while we had a conversation. So it led to some interesting conversations. Obviously, there are some challenges to the interview process, as you have surely learned over the years, meaning, if I'm having a conversation across the table from you, I won't step on your toes because I could tell by your raised eyebrow or your mouth is opening that you're about to speak again. And it's easier to trample on one another's thoughts because you don't know if the other person is done, and so on. But I've been able to do quite a few conversations that way. I finally just returned to the real world again. The most recent episode I recorded, where I think people you may have had on the show, there are 3 local writers, all of whom published their second novels. Sarah Pinsker, K.M. Sparra, and Karen Osborne all published their second novels within 3 months of each other, and I thought that must be captured. So I got donuts, we had some Greek food, and we sat down about the joy and challenges of gee, you had an entire lifetime to write the first novel and you had a year to turn in the second novel. What is that pressure like? So that will probably be episode 151. But I am finally now with that we're getting vaccinated and we feel safe together, have returned to that, and it has been wonderful.
Yeah, so I mean, so if you listen to this podcast and there are any authors that you wish that I had interviewed that I haven't yet, go check out Eating the Fantastic, and maybe you'll find them on Scott's list.
And that's one of the wonderful things. Unfortunately, we just learned today, as of the time of this recording, the great writer William F. Nolan passed away. Most people would know him as a co-writer of Logan's Run, and I did an episode with him 4 years ago when he was a mere 89 years old, discussing his life, and the fact that those who did not know how wonderful he was can listen to 90 minutes of me and him chatting about him knowing Ray Bradbury and all other things, and talking about knowing Rod Serling writing for The Twilight Zone. That's sort of one of the reasons why we do this. We want people to learn to like and love the people we like and love, and the fact that it can live on. It was very bittersweet listening to some of Bill's voice today, but knowing that, hey, you can still go out. He passed at 93, so he had a wonderful long life. You can still go out and learn more about him, and it felt like a privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's so great. I mean, I was telling you a little bit over messaging that, my favorite author growing up was Roger Zelazny, and I've looked and looked and looked, and I found on YouTube there's one video of him giving a reading, and one time when a friend gave me a CD with an audio interview. And that's all that I've been able to find. So just, I think this current age that we're in, where you can go online and find, thousands of authors, hour-long, 2-hour-long interviews. I just think is going to be such a great thing for people in the future to be able to find out more about some of their favorite authors.
And I'm trying to do people not just at the peak of their career or in their 80s and 90s. There were so many people I've done at the very beginning of their career before they published their first novel. I think I did K.M. Sparrow, who I mentioned originally, just when his novel had been accepted by an agent and submitted to publishers, had already published some short stories. And my theory was 50 years from now, when you're a grandmaster, people can go back and listen to how it began. Aren't there people now who we wish we could have heard them at the beginning of their careers, what they thought about? So I'm trying to cover all the bases in terms of whom I talk to, not of all stages of career, all parts of science fiction, all comic book writers. Anyway, I'm trying to capture everything and give a true picture of where we happen to be now for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're all out of time. So Scott, do you have any other final thoughts or any other projects that you want to let people know about?
I am continuing with the podcast. I am continuing to do my writing. I never know where I'm going with the writing because, as I said, I am a pantser, not a plotter. I'm working on a story now and navigating my way to what's supposed to be happening toward the end. I think people have already heard all they want to hear from me. They already know whether this is someone they would like to investigate further. I guess probably the only thing I want to end with is we live in an exciting time. This is one of the greatest times for science fiction that we've ever had. I've been reading it since a kid. My first convention was 1970, so 51 years ago in a convention, and we are, except for the fact those magazines on the newsstands are not there anymore, this is about as healthy and vibrant, as exciting as the field has ever been. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great note to end on. So we've been speaking with Scott Edelman about his book, Tell Me Like You've Done Before. So Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Scott Edelman for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.